Mish.
Hey, today we're bringing back the Quar series with our very first character focus. And there is no better name than the father of the Crusade himself to start out the series, Sir Sune Alykinder Rhynn Venk. Now, we've talked about Alykinder in previous episodes, but I believe that he is too important not to have his own. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that he is the most important character in the setting. In fact, he's the catalyst for where we are in the current setting as is. But before I get too ahead of myself, you can expect me to go into the deepest lore dives of Alykinder, and I'm going to be painting his model, which is exclusive to Josh Qualtieri's tribe. But before we get into all that good stuff, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share with a friend, and if you really dig it, consider becoming a channel member. For just $3 a month, you get to see my videos early, and for $5, you get access to a weekly Q&A stream, in which I showcase the viewers' models. You also get access to exclusive roles and channels within the Mishmash Discord, and above everything else, it just really helps me out. Huge thank you to my channel members. You guys are amazing. And if you wish to help the channel further, make sure to check out the affiliate links in the description for some high-quality models and hobby products alike. And make sure to plug in my discount codes, so you can save a little bit extra on some pretty cool stuff. But enough of the promotional bit, let's get tucked in, have a moth cake, and let's talk about the greatest Quar who ever lived. Now, in our previous episodes, I have gone over the basic cliff notes of Alykinder, mostly because I have only really talked about him in the context of the Crusade itself. Mostly because that is what he is most well known for. But would it surprise you that there is far more than meets the eye to the arguably most important Quar who ever lived besides Enkidu? In fact, the life of Alykinder is possibly one of the more well-documented aspects of the lore in general. So we shall go from the beginning to his very mysterious end. Sune Alykinder Rhynn Venk was born in 1711. High in the sprawled mountains in the independent city-state of Skar, part of the nation of Tok, Alykinder would be born into the Sune clan. They were immensely wealthy, though lacked the prestige of Tok's first families. However, their wealth was hard-earned. Generations earlier, Alykinder's great-great-grandfather had started with a humble airship repair stall. By Alykinder's time, it had grown into Sune Industries, the largest airship manufacturer on the eastern continent. Dominant not just in Tok, but across alwyd. They weren't just builders either. Sune Industries bankrolled massive engineering projects across the region. Of course, when politics and war allowed it. Skar itself was a city in the clouds. It stretched along 6 jagged peaks, and was home to nearly 1 million Quar. Life there meant mastering the skies, and like any true son of Skar, Alykinder grew up sure-footed and skybound. He was quite adept at piloting the dirigibles and balloons that Skar citizens used to travel from peak to peak. Alykinder's path in life seemed rather settled from the moment he was born. He would be raised with the intent to continue the family line of business, and perhaps he would be the first to raise the Sune to nobility. But Alykinder had other ideas. He wanted to be a soldier. From a young age, he clashed with his family, particularly his father, as he was disinterested in business and an average student at best, and he made no secrets of his ambitions. The tensions would rise until a week before his 16th birthday. After leaving his parents nothing but a note, he had hitched a ride on a downstream air cargo, and by his 16th birthday, he was in Bul Maren, capital of Tok. Enlisted under a false name, the young buck was then in basic training 2 days later. Unfortunately for the young Alykinder, it would not take long for him and his training yadrils to realize that he, a slight and bookish fellow, would never have the constitution nor the fortitude to be a Tokish rifler. However, they did recognize his exceptional intelligence and problem-solving skills, and he was quickly shipped downriver to Fort Till after basic. There, he found his new home in the Corps of Engineers. By this time, it can be assumed that Alykinder would drop the fake name business and assume his own. However, there's not a lot known about his time in Fort Till. Alykinder's records as a recruit are completely lost, and most of his graduating class were later killed at Goana Creek. It is, however, where he first met and made a lasting impression on then Sune Chot, commander of the engineering school. Alykinder had two rare talents among the Quar, being that he was both a creative thinker and an adept conciliator. With ease, he could soothe over problems between two feuding comrades, and he was well known for sorting out more efficient ways to perform engineering tasks. But after graduating engineering school, Alykinder's first 2 years in the field were spent along the southern border of the 33rd Regiment of Tok, and then later on the 10th Tok Guards. He spent a fairly leisurely time on the southern border learning his craft and staying out of trouble. Alykinder's records from this time are filled with glowing reviews from the young enlisted Quar, and by the end of his 2-year rotation, he was well on his way to making his Kherton. Alykinder was then briefly involved in the Siege of Spiritoul, when the city-state attempted to secede in 1729. But he would spend most of the 6-month battle packing demolition charges for the sappers and keeping his head down during the incessant bombardments. His role there has since been exaggerated by many, but like any good humble soldier, Alykinder has never done so himself. By early 1730, after years of saber-rattling, Lower Barro had finally made its move. Their armies surged across the southern border of Tok, through the Maren Gap, and an invasion was in full force. Alykinder, alongside the 10th Tok Guards, were en route north by a train. They were scheduled for a 3-month refit, however their orders changed and the train never stopped, instead heading directly towards the front. The corps in charge of the northern front was Sil Caneral Losta. He was a seasoned officer fighting a brutal holding action, and he was doing his best to buy time for reinforcements. Despite the Tokish navy doing its best to blockade Holn, the Barroese supply chain had kept flowing overland through the Maren Gap. Losta didn't wait, however, as the moment new troops arrived, he put them to use. His plan was to send the fresh southern units, still unfamiliar with the terrain mind you, to besiege Holn and sever it from the land-based supply lines. Meanwhile, he'd lead a strike force of light infantry to plug the Maren Gap, choking off the Barroese advance at the source. Armored units could then retake Weiss and Brackle before swinging west to relieve Holn. All of this was planned to take place within 10 days. Bayoneer Alykinder had arrived with the rest of the 10th Tok Guards on an unseasonably stormy night. The flashes of lightning were the perfect camouflage for the siege guns that had moved up to fire on Holn. The 10th was among the first units to take up positions along the major roadways running into Holn. Supporting them was the 111th Engineering Battalion, commanded by Sune Chot, former commandant of the Fort Till Engineering School. Chot met his protege engineering student shortly after arrival and transferred him directly to the 111th and promoted him to his Kherton. Unfortunately, the siege of Holn began badly. The early spring storms only increased intensity, and Sil Caneral Losta's armor was late. Not to mention the Barroese forces occupying Holn was held in greater force than the Tokish had imagined. No sooner had the 10th Guards invested the city than the Barroese forces counterattacked with several divisions through the Maren Gap. The Tokish light infantry, unsupported by armor and still fatigued after being in combat for nearly 3 months, were routed by this point. Entire squadrons of armor were abandoned in the muck, and the Barroese army rushed through the gap created by the collapse of the Tokish lines. Now, the 10th Guards and 111th Engineers, unfamiliar with the terrain and left out of the full scope of Losta's plan, set about building elaborate siege works facing Holn. But while they dug in, Tokish light infantry were already being routed in the Maren Gap. No one had told the engineers, and the Barroese struck not from the city but from behind. The first warnings came not from scouts or signal towers, but from scattered survivors stumbling back into the Tokish lines. Moments later, engineer outposts began going silent. They were overrun before they could even mount a defense. Only one officer recognized the danger, Colonel Chott. Acting quickly, he ordered the siege lines turned into rear-facing defenses. The engineers, caught off guard, scrambled to fortify their new fronts, but it was too late. The Barroese hit from both sides, and without reliable maps and no clear sense of the enemy's numbers, Chott tried to pull his forces back over Goana Creek. This was naturally a line back into Tok, but the days of rain had turned it into a flooded, impassable barrier. The retreat was a failure. The attack was a failure. With no orders left to give, Chott gave one final order: surrender. Laying down their arms, they had been outnumbered 5-1. It was a devastating loss for Tok. The campaign had ended in failure, and in the weeks that followed, political leaders from both sides, worn down and bloodied, had brokered an uneasy truce. By this point, a dirty POW camp in Lower Barro was just one of the loose ends unresolved in the truce, and it was there that the remaining members of the former 10th Tok Guards and the 111th Engineers were detained. Though it was high in the mountains, it was as far from the comfortable life Alykinder had come from as one can go. The camp was a dull place. Escape was practically impossible given the remote location of the camp and the open terrain around it. Practically being fed raisins and bones, it was hard not to lose hope. But our Alykinder is resourceful. He kept himself busy with 2 new projects. The first of these was keeping the morale of his fellow prisoners up. Alykinder decided to start a newspaper for the POWs, and in a tiny camp isolated from much of the rest of civilization, it might seem like an unlikely enterprise. But Alykinder knew that keeping busy was far more important than the end product. He began by recruiting his fellow prisoners into various projects. One group was put into work making paper out of old packaging and tuber starch. The other group, mostly the engineers, went about building a makeshift press. Alykinder's silver tongue played a pivotal role, of course, as he traded with the guards for the necessary items. At last, the press is ready. In the first issue, the camp ledger rolled off the press, printed with ink made from boot black and cinder, on paper made from old laundry. This was not lost on Colonel Chott. He had watched his riflers go from despair to activity to even glimmerings of hope. Unfortunately, he had been injured in the final moments at the stand of Goana. His leg had grown infected and had to be amputated, leaving him sick in bed, though he met regularly with Alykinder. This would bloom into a strong friendship as a result. However, I did mention that Alykinder had 2 activities on his mind. The second project was secret and ambitious. Alykinder had begun documenting what had gone wrong with the entire campaign and Siege of Holn, and capturing his thesis in the form of a book. In the minutes before lights out, or whenever he was able to spare 5 minutes, Alykinder had begun carefully dissecting the loss at Holn and writing up his thoughts. Examinations of failure by his Kyrtans were not encouraged by military high commands, and compounding his heresies, Alykinder presented a radical political thesis as well. The failure of the Siege of Holn, he argued, was nothing less than a result of centuries of core society and warfare. Up to this point, war had largely been waged on the basis of sieges and campaigns of limited territorial gain. Wars were accompanied by simultaneous political negotiations, and stringent efforts were made to keep lands and cities intact at the cost of riflers' lives. Alykinder argued that this was because of the heavily interrelated First Families and their interests. A limited war would preserve the value of property and land. Riflers were an expendable resource in this context, but a city wasn't. The traditional siege style of warfare, indeterminate, protracted, and usually accompanied by political considerations, a process designed to leave the target largely intact and promote the profile of the upper class, was a system Alykinder declared both morally wrong and militarily futile. There could be no end to the Long War so long as the First Families and their policies control the politics of the nations. Alykinder's thesis and ultimate goal was to end war and the Long War itself. He was to concentrate not on siege and limited territorial gain, but to take as much territory as quickly as possible to shock the other side into a political resolution. Enemy forces should be engaged only to pin them in position. so as to allow other troops to take weakly held areas of strategic importance. Alykinder calculated that the logistical support needed to move the massive siege equipment could easily be used to bypass strong points in favor of lightning strikes on more sensitive targets. One night in 1734, after the newspaper press had finished for the day, Alykinder shooed his workers out of the print room and sat down to print a slim book called The Principles of Applied Air Power. This book would become known simply as Principles as Alykinder ascended to power. The next morning, a somewhat nervous Alykinder presented the book to Colonel Chott. Though severely ill from his infection, Chott spent 2 days reading and rereading the little book. When Alykinder next visited him, the two spoke in low, serious tones. The details of this conversation would never come to light. However, by the end of their conversation, Chott would embrace Alykinder. In 1735, a political resolution in the POWs was reached. Once the prisoners were released and returned to Tok, Alykinder was promoted to Cairton and assigned to Tok's North Border Military District. This region included his hometown of Skar, and on clear days it was possible to see the closest city-states of Lower Barro. However, Chott, sorely weakened by his illness, passed away just minutes before the returning prisoners would have passed into Tok. With the death of Chott, he became a convenient scapegoat upon which to pin the blame for the debacle at Goana, thereby preserving the military reputation of Losta, whose clan was far more influential at court. The 111th was now reduced from a regular line to a militia formation, with the bulk of its enlisted and officers to consist of conscript and part-time riflers. It was the kind of posting that normally spells the end of a military career for a young officer like Alykinder. But Alykinder being himself, he maintained close ties with many of the officers from the days of the POW camp, and was eager to see the ideas laid out in principles set into practice. Plus, he could now rely on his family name to help coordinate the airship support his new tactics and strategies would rely on. The prominence and prestige of the Sunes was more than sufficient to ensure his own reputation was preserved, though he was undoubtedly scarred by the loss of his former commander. And this would be reflected in his writings, as they often mention the slandering of Chott with great bitterness. Within a year, Alykinder had 3 small airships, and the 111th trained in parachute insertion. Within 18 months, he had 9 ships, a full brigade of airship marines, and 2 of the berths at Sune Industries were occupied by a pair of monstrous military transports. Christened the Long Walker, these were lengthened versions of Sune's most successful freighter design. Now a full corps of eager airship designers, crew, and military officers busied themselves experimenting with tactics. At the same time, as heir to Sune Industries, Alykinder encouraged merchant clans on either side of the Tok/Barro border to work out informal and lucrative trade agreements. Some degree of trade had always existed between the countries, except when war was waging, so the merchants and industrial clans were quick to take advantage of Alykinder's inducements. Alykinder began developing a taste for political coalition at this point. Between his guidance to militia forces and forming the Airmobile Corps and his work in the northern provinces. By 1740, northern Tok and southern Barro cities had formed a loose political alliance. Merchant airships went freely between city-states on both sides, protected by militia forces trained in Alykinder's principles. It was not exactly a rebellion, but rather a strong streak of independence on the part of these city-states. But moving between and among them was Alykinder, and the Quar of the mountains strongly respected him. Interpreting the silence along the Tok and lower Barro front as a sign of weakness, the forces of Kryst launched a surprise attack along the Svrald with the intention of bringing the region within their sphere of influence. An old Kryst regency claim was used as an excuse for the war, though the pretext was transparent even by Quar standards. Kryst is not as populous as either Tok nor Barro, but many of his troops were veterans, particularly its widely feared mountaineer brigades. The Kryst Offensive was classical Quar doctrine, investing a number of city-states by cutting off their roads, then conducting a classical siege operation while simultaneously opening negotiations. But with the diplomats of Kryst wrangled in the Tokish capital of Bul Maren, Alykinder and Skar was on the front lines and unwilling to negotiate. Falling back through the mountains, he traded space for time, blocking passes, tearing up roads, and drawing the Kryst advance deeper into the Svrald. And all the while, he was quietly calling the storm. Alykinder would recall the entirety of the airmobile Quar from posts scattered around the mountains, and would cycle them through the Skar's overburdened yards. In a literal sense, it was supporting nearly 3 times the airship capacity the docks were built for. However, he was not yet ready to make his next move. For most of the year, the prevailing winds in the region blew from Kryst. But for just a few short weeks, the winds reverse, a seasonal counterwind. To Kryst commanders, the siege of Skar was going rather smoothly. The Tokish retreat seemed disorganized, and resistance was present, but light. Disrupted roads were an inconvenience, but not a barrier. Confident, they stretched their lines thin across the mountains. It was at that point the wind shifted. The entire airmobile corps blasted forth from Skar in force. The operation was a masterstroke of meticulous timing and eager troops led by brilliant operation officers. Kryst's siege line resulted in mass panic, with some airmobile forces conducting operations well within Kryst itself. The Kryst army was shattered well before it could even mount an effective resistance, and thousands of POWs were scooped up. In Bul Maren, the negotiators of Kryst immediately sued for peace. The negotiations themselves were among the most sweeping seen on Alwyd in centuries, significantly expanding upon the areas that Tok controlled. This time, there was no nominal transfer of 1 or 2 key locations. Alykinder had seen that Tok's boundaries now include the entire area of operations for the airmobile corps. The lower Barro cities were just as happy to see their relations formalized. Though Alykinder's plan was undoubtedly brilliant, it was unfortunately seen as a fluke.
After all, didn't most of the fighting happen near siege areas? Ergo, sieges are still the defining feature of warfare.
But this would still work to his favor after all. In Tok and for the North, Alykinder was a hero. Swept into political power by popular acclaim, his rise had only just begun. And it was then, at the height of his fame, that he released the first public printings of Principles. Finally, the young soldier's words would be known to the world at large. Though Alykinder was hailed as the greatest political force in northern Tok, and undeniably the architect of one of the most brilliant military victories in recent history, he did not foresee the backlash brewing in Bul Maren. The throne was occupied by King Venk IX, a weak figurehead barely more than ceremonial. The true power behind the crown was his cousin, Duke Aiko, the king's privy counselor, and a master of quiet manipulation. Aiko saw exactly what Alykinder's rise meant. He read between the lines of Principles and found not just a theory of war, but the end of the first families. He knew full well Alykinder's vision didn't include dukes or privilege, and he quickly moved to strike first. In court, Alykinder's name was buried, and his nomination for knighthood was quietly drawn. The credit for the miracle of Skar was reattributed to a young viscount whose only connection to the operation was that he happened to be on a goodwill tour with the North when it happened. Then came the real blow. Aiko restructured the Tokish army, placing control of regional militias into the hands of colonels loyal to him. The airmobile corps, the very force that had redefined modern warfare, was disbanded. Its airships privatized, handed out to Aiko's allies like party favors. Even the famous Longwalkers were stripped of their colors and converted into common freighters. The Goana Creek, once a symbol of sacrifice, was transformed into Aiko's personal military yacht. For 2 full years, Alykinder fought back with what little influence he had left. He railed what support he could in the north, but in the capital, Aiko's grip was absolute. With no real allies and no fleet to command, Alykinder could only watch in frustration as everything he had built was dismantled, rewritten, erased, and completely stolen. If the blood-soaked valley of Goana Creek was the ground in which the seed of the crusade was first planted, Duke Aiko would be the fool to water it. In early 1746, Tok's lakefront stronghold Dunport braced for war. Alykinder would be the man sent to lead its defense, and would arrive drenched in sweat, carrying a sealed message he feared would be his own death sentence. Tok was to declare war on Kryst in 2 months, but the frontier was still in the dark. Dunport had always been the first domino. Like with every nation in Alwyd, Kryst's playbook never changed: cut it off and hold it hostage. But Alykinder was determined to use his own strategy once more, hitting first and hitting hard. After gutting Command HQ, he seized every ship he could and converted Dunport's fishing fleet into a strike force. This time, in a bid to not allow any confusion on how things went down, he made sure to bring along a journalist, Dane Bohr. As you can probably guess, his role was to document the chaos. On the 1st of Hennefeld, 1746, Alykinder's ragtag littoral brigade hit the Kryst coast like pirates, blowing up ships, torching supply dumps, and vanishing back into the fog. The invasion of Tok stalled, then stalled again, and then again. Bohr's essay, later published as the Lake Raiders, turned Alykinder into a proper legend. But he wouldn't stop there, as the deeper he struck, the more ambitious he became. Reinvigorating his renegade streak, Alykinder would ignore orders to hold and set his sights in Kryst's fortress capital. The plan? A frontal assault down the causeway. Unfortunately, it did prove to be brutal and costly, and Alykinder would regret the blood price, though it would work in the end. However, the veterans of Dunport wore that battle like a badge. The war ended 2 weeks later, the city held, and the campaign was over. Alykinder's star was rising, once again proving his way was effective. By 1747, Alykinder returned to the north, but he was met not with a reward but a calculated exile. Duke Iko, threatened by Alykinder's growing popularity, ordered him to prepare an invasion of Lower Barro, essentially planning to bury him in bureaucracy and distance him from his political base. But due to Iko being completely tone-deaf, this plan backfired as Alykinder arrived in Skar like a conquering hero. He commanded the loyalty of young officers and had the pick of Tok's newest weapons, and he made no effort to hide his intentions. War with Lower Barro was coming, and he meant to win it fast. He sent envoys ahead, warning the Barroese city-states that they could either resist or join Tok with minimal bloodshed. To prove he was serious, he launched massive airdrop drills and airship demonstrations. Then, in open defiance of Tok's high command, Alykinder began the invasion a week early. By the time the official war declaration was signed, he had already secured 3 city-states and was about to gain 2 more. The city-state of Mulf was the only one to properly resist. Properly only in the technical sense, as the 1st Airmobile Brigade quickly stomped them. Negotiations were attempted, but Alykinder refused any delegation not authorized to sign a ceasefire. He declared that his war zone was under military, not civilian control, and even royal agents were turned away. From the deck of his forward command ship Goana Creek, Alykinder ran a rapid discipline campaign. With air mobility, radio coordination, and relentless speed, his forces advanced up to 20 kilometers a day, while Lower Barro's militias relied on couriers who were often captured before even delivering their messages. Barrowe's strong points were outflanked, encircled, starved of supplies, and Alykinder turned field fortifications into traps. Within just months, Lower Barro's military was paralyzed, the government had completely collapsed and fled into exile, and Alykinder had installed a new loyal regime, and remade their army in the image of Tok's. And the beauty of it all, this was all meant to be his undoing, and it ultimately became his masterstroke. By 1748, Alykinder wasn't just winning wars, he was reshaping Tok itself. Fresh from the victory in Lower Barro, Alykinder had turned to politics. Now with allies in parliament and the loyalty of military governors, he was appointed governor of not only the Svrald, but the newly annexed Barro March. Crucially, he retained control over the Zone of Operations, a legal loophole that kept military regions under his personal control, even in peacetime. By his 45th birthday, Alykinder ruled more land than most Quar monarchs. His rise wasn't just in military force, it was ideological, as the growing Crusader movement, with its populist fury against the First Families, had finally found its hero in Alykinder. His victories and propaganda machine kept the movement surging, but Alykinder's real legacy came through reform. He had dismantled and fractured the command structure of Tok's army, folding royal and commissioned Kotrods into a unified force. Even the elite guard, once semi-autonomous units who answered only to the king, were brought to heel. No longer able to bypass orders through court, the guards were folded into larger light infantry armies. This consisted of mixed formations of militia, artillery, and cavalry, all under corps command. The guards remained elite, but now served as a flexible spearhead, not a rogue element. And I'm sure it's shocking for you to know that Alykinder once again redefined air warfare. Airmobile armies became modular, designed not only to hold territory, but to hit hard and redeploy. Paratroopers dropped in fast to take ground and disrupt lines. Lander Marines followed in with heavier gear, arriving on disposable airships meant to be broken down into fuel, parts, or fortifications. His beloved Long Walker-class airship became the backbone of the force, escorted by sleek Talon Path destroyers. Every operation was temporary, fluid, and hard to track. This would leave enemy spies absolutely baffled as to the exact number and organization of the airmobile brigades. By 1756, through Alykinder's reform, Tok would now resemble the modern juggernaut it would be known to be. Now, by 1757, a freighter arrived in Dunport flying a false flag. The army within that marched forward was none other than Toulmore's volunteers led by Kjartan Kellerim Key. Toulmore had been carved up by foreign powers generations ago, and its people saw in Alykinder's principles a path to freedom and Alykinder himself a man worth following. Without any terms, Key offered his brigade, and Alykinder posted them quietly to the Kryst border. Though a political marriage between both sides had returned territory to Kryst, neither side trusted one another. After armies had gathered in secret, shots rang around the Gaia Oasis, and each side blamed the other. A second war with Kryst had officially begun. Within 2 weeks, Alykinder had arrived, and with one goal in mind: a total defeat of the Kryst army. Kryst fought like no foe before. No trenches, no strongholds, just fast desert troops striking at will. It would seem the world was slowly waking up to Alykinder's way of warfare. However, rather than a full stomp, Alykinder would utilize propaganda urging Kryst militias to stand down. Aircraft, including airships, dropped leaflets onto the city-states whose loyalty to the ruling class of Kryst was tentative. The growing resentment would result in the militia of Kryst being unwilling to rush to the front lines. They were unwilling to risk their lives for a class that they despised. While undersupplied and demoralized, the Kryst regulars had decided to take up their arms and go home. However, they never properly surrendered. With their newfound rebellious spirit, the monarchy of Kryst had fallen, and Alykinder had replaced it with a clan republic loyal to Tok. Not only would this prove to be beneficial politically, both the army of Tok learned how to fight in the desert, while the Kryst had created their first airmobile corps. This once again proved Alykinder to be a true leader. Once bitter enemies, Kryst and Tok were now relatively friendly allies. But from 1758 onward, Alykinder's popularity in Tok only surged to a fever pitch. Crowds filled the streets, fireworks, wreaths, chants. Wherever he went, the Quar followed. The Crusaders swept the lower parliament, and even some nobles began backing the movement. Funnily enough, Alykinder was offered dukedom, but he politely and pointedly declined. King Venk himself had offered enfeoffment to Alykinder, though he deferred it to his older sister, who would become Viscountessa Barro. And what of Duke Aiko? Well, being the one who arranged the political alliance with Kryst that had fallen into shambles as a result of the Hasty War, was now a rightfully marginalized figure in the court. However, he would keep up the work in trying to throw out roadblocks in session and various non-binding denouncements of the Crusader principles. Though his cronies slowly began disappearing, and few in number, they still made up for this in being the loudest ones in the room. But when it came down to it, the power of the king and the royal clan were gradually rolled back. The noble chamber had officially faded into a ceremonial role, and older systems of labor and taxation were abolished. By 1760, King Venk was forced to accept a new national charter, recasting the country as a parliamentary democracy. For the first time in over half millennia, a major nation of Alwyd was no longer ruled by a king. Though Tok had no king nor an official ruler, everybody and their mother recognized Alykinder as the true leader of Tok. Alykinder would then begin traveling the nation, drilling troops and preaching the Crusade's message that the long war would only end when the first families could no longer trade lives for power. Though they were already on good terms, Alykinder's word became scripture in the land of
Toulmore.
Tok. Underground presses printed his speeches as fast as they were seized. Young bucks of Toulmore had fled to join the Volunteer Brigade, which had now become a full army in strength. During this time, war had loomed on the horizon once more. Tension between the kingdoms of Kryst and Mare Breach had reached a boiling point over several contested Toulmorese city-states. In desperation, Key had met privately with Alykinder. The very next day, Alykinder stood before Parliament and declared that the Crusade will not stop at Tok's borders. He would call upon the citizens of Toulmore to rise up, and for the nation of Tok to go to war. The response was immediate, and in Toulmore, rebel groups had unified and revolted. Airborne Marines dropped into the cities to support the uprisings. The Crown Prince of Toulmore had even given up his royal name in favor of becoming a proper Iskertan in the army of Tok, famously declaring that he would rather die as a free crusader than live as a chained king. The Tokish element would do their best to hold off Crysilians, whilst the Toulmorese Marines and militia would work together to completely liberate the capital from Mare Breach. During this time, the Koftir border army had actually attempted to storm through the Tokish army. Rather unsuccessfully, mind you. By the end of the second year of the Crusade, Kryst's army had officially surrendered unconditionally to the Tokish army, all while Toulmore had officially pushed back Mare Breach and Koftir. At the end of the third year of the Crusade, peace negotiations were concluded, and the Toulmore Republic was officially created, and with its borders extended to the area of the Old Kingdom. Kryst was to become a constitutional monarchy on the line of Tok, with the first families of that nation to enter into exile in Mare Breach. For the first time in generations, an enforced peace was to be kept between Kryst and Toulmore. At this time, the exiles of Kryst would coin the term Iron Regime in reference to Tok and its allies. Not to be crass, but they were a little butt mad. Now, in 1765, with the army of Tok abroad, Duke Iko made his move. He rallied loyal officers at home and formed a breakaway army, the Provisional Imperial Army, promising a return to the old order. Parliament was suspended, martial law was declared, and Alykinder was convicted of treason in a sham court. But Alykinder responded with fury. He would return home with the largest airborne force the world of Alwyd had ever seen. The army was promptly surrounded and destroyed, however the aftermath would scar Alykinder for life. These were not trained soldiers, they were armed civilians. Completely forced to fight in suicidal attacks, Alykinder's face was stricken at the sight of the piles of corpses. Simple citizens of Tok, many of whom had lived in the capital for generations, were now forced to fight against the best-trained army in the history of Alwyd. It was a sickening contrast between Alykinder's regard for his own soldiers and the former duke's complete and total disregard for his own citizens. In the final stand of the Imperial Palace, cadets from the King's Institute, still dressed in uniform, charged the first guards but were promptly cut down. Duke Iko had died leading them. Alykinder was present to witness the removal of Duke Iko's body. He had seen his nemesis surrounded by the young Quar who had died for the privilege of the first families, and he wept. The body of King Venk was also found amongst the dead, and his demise is murky to say the least. Royalist sympathizers claim he was killed by the Crusade, while the crusade itself claims his bodyguard had taken his life in fear of capture. Though the aftermath was grim, the problems for the crusade would only begin to rise. Outside of the core crusader states, Alykinder was deemed a pariah. Of the crusader states, the exile nobles were welcomed abroad, and whispers grew that the so-called Iron Regime was splintering. At home, Alykinder had approved of the formation of a secret police, the Special Branch of Security. This was led by the Minister of Interior, Taswin Crick. The goal of this branch was to crush royalist dissent before it could even spark. Even among the Crusaders, doubts festered and old clan traditions were eroding. The dream of ending the Long War now seemed to demand endless warfare. By 1767, the royalist houses of Creevin, Fidwog, and Koftir had banded together to form a royalist front against the crusade. The Grand Army of Kings was officially formed, and had officially outnumbered the Crusaders nearly 2-1. But, unsurprisingly, they were plagued by rivalries and mistrust. Along with this, the crusade was no longer a thrown-together force. There were larger numbers of veteran troops hardened by years of war. The death of the Grand Army of Kings came in pieces. The first major domino was the fall of Maer Breach, as well as the eventual fall of Easki, Sleven, and their main ally, Creevin. The nature in which warfare had been conducted had changed drastically since the first days of Alykinder's service. Long were the days of siege and counter-siege. Large formations of cavalry are almost unknown, now replaced with new and terrible weapons. By the end of the Crusade's 9th year, the only nations which had not separately negotiated a peace with the Crusader states were Koftir and Fidwog. However, it can be fairly said that the Crusader army is not large enough to control these surrendered nations. Unlike the previous adversaries of the Crusade, these former royalist states were meant to remove their kings and provide fresh legions for the Crusaders. However, they showed no such compliance beyond empty words. Despite the efforts of the Special Branch, royalist insurrections were known to be occurring or have occurred inside Upper Barro, Kryst, and even Tok itself. The Crusader army is fighting a war on two fronts, and is further extended by control of captured territory and suppressing insurrections. In desperation, the Crusader army is making increased use of penal formations, forcing criminals into service rather than prison. This, coupled with retirement and loss of some key officers and veterans, has diluted the fighting capacity of these armies. The Royalist factions can be said to be unified in their opposition to the Crusade, but beyond that they do still share little in common. All armies continue to rely on the conscript soldier at their core, just as they have for the last 700 years of the Long War. There is no greater representation of the common state of the Quar than the lone rifler on the march, rifle in hand. A brave son of Alwyd carrying a heavy weight, marching towards an uncertain future. Now, the writings of Alykinder's remaining years in the lore is relatively sporadic. However, they are not insignificant. By 1770, 2 years after the fall of the Grand Army of Kings, Alykinder himself would crown Mavin Dowager of Evivenverta as the Imperial Regent of Creevin. This will be something we come back to in a later video. However, in the same year, Maer Breach, though spared the worst of the war, was utterly bankrupt. Alykinder would extend an offer, join the Crusade willingly, and Maer Breach would become its industrial heart. The Commonwealth Treaty would be officially signed, and Maer Breach would officially become a Crusader state. 3 years later, a record-setting brutal Kithwin would come and shatter economies across Alwyd. Of course, this would take place during the first attack on Koftir, completely dismantling a sure victory in the eyes of the Crusade. Along with this, the rumbling royalist revolts erupted. The aforementioned nations of Kryst, Lower Barro, and Kreisel rose into full-fledged rebellion. Major supply lines from east to west were fully collapsed. Maer Breach's port, still unfinished, opened early to armed convoys of Tok. But by year's end, these convoys ceased and enemy fleets dominated Lake Morandi. In response, Mayor Breach's factory shifted overnight to war production. Trucks rolled straight from the factory to the front line. Within a year's time, Crusader forces had fully retreated from Koftir. Camps had sprung up across Mayor Breach, and the population welcomed the returning troops. Many Crusaders took root, starting farms, marrying locals, and swelling the army's ranks with Mayor Breachy recruits. The once occupied nation had officially become the Crusade's refuge. However, by 1777, the rumors of Alykinder's failing health had spread across Alwyd. Unfortunately, these rumors appear substantiated as the father of the Crusade disappeared from the public for many months at a time. And when he was seen, it was quick and short. Along with this, Tok, the home of the Crusade, and Alykinder himself was nearly in a state of civil war. In the twilight of Alykinder's years, a new champion of the Crusade would make his face known in the form of Caertan Loek. After declaring himself Camprig of the Western Crusade, he would officially become the backbone of the current Crusade itself. Though Alykinder's Crusade had officially shattered into multiple pieces, there is still a glimmer of hope that his ideals and everything he had fought for would finally come true. But Alykinder would not be able to see this with his own eyes. As of 1780, Sune Alykinder Rhynn Venk would become one with his ancestors and Alwyd alike. To this day, the circumstances of Alykinder's passing remain a mystery. However, in life, Alykinder was able to change the face of an entire planet, for better and for worse. Breaking molds formed by centuries of practice and tradition, Alykinder had done something no other Quar was able to do. Besides Enkidu. And although I am a dirty royalist sympathizer, I think it is more than fair to say that Alykinder truly is the greatest Quar to ever live. Eras aren't just forged by blood or leaps in technology. They are defined by the bold and great bucks and dynas of their time. Those rare few willing to do what no one else dared. Though I do work on the game, and this may come off as me just kissing ass, Alykinder is genuinely one of my favorite characters in literary history. Like with all the Quars, they're not that different from you and I. Sure, there are things that they can't comprehend on the same level we do, and there's plenty of things we can't comprehend on their level, but they're not much different from human beings. Alykinder had a choice. He could have lived a cushy life, but at the young age of 15, he chose to be a soldier. He chose to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. He chose to single-handedly spearhead against an ideology that generations of Quar have only known. And I can only hope that his son will walk in the footsteps of his father before him, and not become the puppet of New Age royalism. Well, I can't think of a better way to commemorate the life of Alykinder than painting his model. Though there's plenty of characters I would like to see get a model at some point, he deserves one more than anybody. To base coat his iconic green coat, I'm using Wa Flesh from Citadel. This is kind of the perfect color. It's almost identical to the source material. For his iconic top hat, I decided to go with a mixture of neutral gray and rubber black 1:1. You could just use the exact same colors for the entirety of both his pants and his boots, but I decided the pants would be a darker black, while the boots would be rubber black. Just makes sense to paint boots with rubber black, right? You could also paint the glasses the exact same color, however, I do think it is fun to differentiate things just a little bit. I don't know, it's more of an artsy project as you won't be really fielding this guy on the tabletop. Now for his flesh, I decided to go with kind of a different route to painting yellow, as I wanted to give it kind of a slate green undertone. For this, I'm taking AK Interactive's Deep Yellow and mixing it roughly 5:1 with dark green brown from Proacryl. This mixture also makes it much easier to base coat. For his glasses, I'll first be painting these using pure black. You'll want to be very careful not to spill this on the yellow if you paint the flesh first. Just use a very nice detailed brush. But once that dried, I would mix together some Warped Lightning from Army Painter with a little bit of the deep yellow, and I would go over all the raised surfaces. Already, this practically creates his flesh tone 1-to-1 besides the spots. Though the undertone definitely does make this a lot easier to do, this still takes plenty of time as you don't want the yellow to be chunky. Just be patient and go over this slowly with very thin layers. Again, about 2 will do it. Now for his little bow tie, I would base coat this using burnt red from Peracryl. Do your best to not get this on the jacket, as it will be kinda difficult to remove if you stain it, but it's not really an issue if you brace your hand. For his cane, I would simply use a little bit of dark green brown, and I would begin shading over the entirety of the clothing besides the shirt using some Oblivion Black Wash. For the shirt itself, I would utilize just a little bit of Battle Mud Wash. I neglected to mention this, however, as I actually ended up using a little bit of dark brown to base coat the squirrel pendant. You can use any kind you like. I believe I used a little bit of Rhinox hide. This is not entirely imperative, but it does make life easier. Also, give the wash a good amount of time to dry. And once the Oblivion Black Wash had dried, I would layer over all the raised surfaces of the jacket using a 1-to-1 mixture of Wa Flesh and Faded Green from AK Interactive. I'll just make sure to pick up over the raised surfaces, and we'll pick up with the highlights later on. Once that was dry, I would use a full highlight of Faded Green over the raised surfaces, and this is mostly done in a sketchy manner to kinda somewhat recreate the watercolor design. This is very fun, but it's very easy to get carried away with, so being sparing is definitely a need. Now for his glasses, I would mix Payne's Gray and Faded Ultramarine 1-to-1, and it would create a relatively simplistic but cartoony glass blue. Blending these colors together does give a better look overall, and doing it similarly to how you would paint lenses is definitely the go-to, but I was pretty simplistic with my application. Now to tie the jacket all together, I would use a very, very thin glaze of Wa Flesh and apply it over the entirety of the jacket. Want to go very slow with this and do not go in excess. It is way easier to add too much than to take away. To ballpark it, I would say I went over around 3 times. Once I was happy with the amount that I applied to the jacket itself, I would highlight it over the bow tie using a little bit of deep red from AK Interactive. It's a very nice cherry red. But now to paint the spots on the entirety of his flesh, I would once again use some dark green brown. This is the perfect color, and being sporadic with the application really does go a long while. Remember, the older Quar gets, the more spots they have, and Alykinder was an old soul by the end of his life. So I went pretty heavy with this. After doing so, to finish off the bow tie completely, I would use a little bit of Dragon Red from Army Painter, and I would paint the Crusader symbol using a little bit of bronze. This would be followed by a very light highlight of rich gold mixed 1-to-1 with the bronze, and I would call Alykinder complete. Honestly, this is a really simplistic paint scheme. Though when you get down to it, it kinda makes sense. Alykinder is not a terribly detailed character. He doesn't have any weapons or anything like that. And honestly, painting the plaid wouldn't be a terrible idea. But at the end of the day, this video has gotten extremely long in the tooth, and I just want to say if you made it this far, sincerely thank you. This was the first video I've ever done on the channel that actually required a delay. I put a lot of love and effort into this, and I'm burnt to a crisp. All the more reasoning why I humbly ask if you could like, comment, and subscribe. This was something that I wasn't really expecting to do, but it's deserved. Ended up really getting captivated retelling this, and I don't think I could have it any other way. A video dedicated to Alykinder needs to be this long. Even though it is kind of a drain on my sanity, I don't really mind all too much, because Quar is my favorite wargame, and I want to do right by it. Alykinder, like I said, is one of my favorite characters in literary history. There are definitely plenty of characters I want to work on for the series, and there's all sorts of different tractors, so make sure to be vocal in the comments. It would mean a lot to me. But I've definitely been flapping my beak enough for one video, so like always, remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.